Honest Field Guide podcast, a weekly show dedicated to winning in entrepreneurship. I'm your host, JinJa Birkenbeuel. I'm the CEO of Birk Creative, a leadership, brand strategy, and visual identity agency dedicated to helping scale brands and assist with their adaptability with the market. On my show, you get to eavesdrop in on intimate conversation with business leaders and inspired entrepreneurs, designed to give you tips and strategies so your own business can thrive. Subscribe and join me each week for laughter, inspiration, and honest stories. Hey everybody, welcome back to my show, the Honest Field Guide podcast. I am your host, JinJa Birkenbeuel. I want to thank you for joining me today. Please like, follow, or subscribe to my show wherever you listen to podcasts. I would be so excited. All right, so if you've been following me, and I have a lot of great fans and a lot of great guests on my show, you know that NASA is one of my favorite agencies of all time. It's one of my obsessions. I've interviewed scientists from NASA. I was even invited to the Kennedy Space Center a while back to watch Crew 8 go to the space station a couple years back. It was really exciting. And, I've even sort of worked on some creative strategies for NASA. So I'm always really obsessed with like space. And so last year, I attended this event at LA Tech Week, and I met this amazing woman at a networking event, and she worked at NASA, and she invited me to join her at this huge event that was announcing the launch of a new like science space company. I was like, oh my God, where am I? Who are all these amazing people? Like I walked into this place and like met all these super smart, super interesting like space, aerospace engineers and rocket scientists and entrepreneurs in the space economy. If you're not familiar with the space economy, you absolutely have to go to Google or go to ChatGPT or Perplexity or wherever you do your like searches and just type in space economy and you'll find out what that means. So the reason why I'm saying all these things is because when I went to this event, I met this really interesting person who is my guest today. He's got a fantastic company. Dr. Albarran is a space physicist and computational scientist who specializes in modeling how charged particles move around Earth and affect satellites and space systems. A NASA heliophysics subject matter expert and co-founder of Electromancer Space Corporation, he builds advanced simulation tools that connect cutting-edge space science with practical spacecraft protection solutions. Dr. Albarran uses powerful computers to study how tiny particles move around Earth and create things like the Northern Lights so we can better protect satellites and technology. I want to let everybody know that's listening in. Unfortunately, Roberto's on the road right now, so he's not on camera. So please forgive this because he's an amazing person, but we're going to take him in any way that we can because he is like a superhero to me. I'm trying to think when I was researching you and getting background, I was like, oh my gosh, how do I explain what Robert does in very simple terms to a young person that's on a STEM career path so that they understand? How would you explain this? So here's what I did before you answer. I actually typed in your company and I typed in a lot of other information I knew about you. And this is the description that came up from a bunch of different AI tools. Okay, Dr. Albarran uses powerful computers to study how tiny space particles move around Earth and create things like the Northern Lights so we can better protect satellites and technology.
Yes, that's not incorrect.
What would you change about that statement, or what would you add to it so that it makes sense to an average everyday person that is not a scientist like you are?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, some of the beauty of doing space physics is that we can do two things that are very powerful. One, we can send hardware to space, and space physics is different than astrophysics. Instead of looking through telescopes at galaxies really far away, in astronomy and astrophysics, space physics is different because we can send satellites right to that location. Instead of looking far away and remote sensing, we can send satellites to listen, to see, to feel, to touch, to taste the plasma environment in its immediate surrounding. So that's one thing that's very exciting about space physics. We can send hardware to other planets. We can send hardwares to, around the sun. We've explored all the major planets, the major moons of our solar system. And we understand that Earth, reacts and responds to the energy from the sun. And this is the field called heliophysics. So helio, we think of Helios, the sun god, and so that's the study of the sun. So we can send hardware to these places and do in situ measurements. So instead of remote sensing looking far away, we place the hardware sensors right in the heart of the plasma environment and take in situ measurements. So that's something that's very interesting. The second part is the software capabilities. Now, we've come a long way with mathematical formalisms to study, fluids and charged particles moving around as fluids in something called magnetohydrodynamics, or MHD. And what's amazing today is that the power of computers allows us to resolve these charged particles not as a fluid, but as an individual charged particles bouncing around. So if you think of a glass of water, right? You have a glass of water, you're tipping it around, it has pressure gradients, it starts splashing, water out of the glass. And mathematically, we can look at all of those, you know, H2O molecules in a glass of water behaving together like macroscopic fluid. And that's a little bit, kind of rough around the edges, a lot of approximations and things like that. But with today's computers, we can resolve each individual particle. So this is something called kinetic physics. So kinetic is like kind of microscopic little individual pieces. So instead of taking averages and these large statistical smoothing, curves and averages of the behavior of fluids, we can resolve with really amazing precision and resolution the modeling of the kinetic physics. So that's kind of what I do. So I my background is mostly kinetic modeling of space plasmas, and then with Electromancer we do that and combine it with in situ measurements in space.
I want to back up a little bit because I'm not a scientist, so some of what you said definitely went over my head. You know what I mean? And I love that about you. But I really kind of want to talk a little about the early days of your life because you didn't just arrive, talking about tiny space particles, right? So I was reading when you were really young that you loved looking at the stars, that they inspired you. And I'm curious, what did you see in the stars that sparked your imagination as a child?
Well, when I was growing up, I was a lot into poetry, music, art. I wasn't very good at math. In fact, I kept failing math through high school. It took me many years to get good at math. When I did my undergraduate at the University of Hawaii at Hilo in astronomy, in the Big Island of Hawaii, they have the big telescopes of Mauna Kea. I was doing star tours there. I was doing observatory tours. I helped build some exoplanet detectors with the Subaru telescope, the Japanese observatory. And I had a wonderful math teacher. And this guy, I remember his name was also Roberto, and he just came out of Caltech. He was 27 years old with a PhD, and he was teaching some calculus classes at the university. And I saw him go up onto the board, and he grabbed this chalk and started drawing these what looked like hieroglyphics on the chalkboard, and these strange symbols. And me as an artist, like I appreciated that, and I appreciated the fact that he explained what these symbols meant. And then it kind of clicked in my mind. I was an artist, musician, poet, and then I started thinking, okay, numbers are a way to express a larger idea. They're like musical notes on the sheet of paper, or they're like different colors on a painter's palette. And it's a medium to express an emotion, to express an idea. And I was like, okay, numbers are not what I thought they were. They're not the stale, boring mathematics. It's actually an art. So then that's the moment where my mind switched, and I was like, okay, numbers are a medium to express something. And then I thought to myself, if I could express something in numbers, I can express anything. So that's really where it led me down into the scientific path.
So, what was your earliest childhood memory of space? Because you're describing a time frame when you were older, and I was actually asking you about when you were a little boy. Like I was asking you about your childhood dreams that got you to the place where you were, at the University of Hawaii. So I'm kind of curious about those early moments.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Let me think. The first job that I wanted when I was younger, I wanted to be a whale trainer.
You wanted to be a what?
A
Did you say
whale
a whale
trainer.
trainer?
Yeah, yeah. At SeaWorld, the people in the
Yes,
spandex jumping
I know
around,
exactly what you mean.
playing
Yes.
with beach balls and killer whales and stuff. I wanted to do that.
That is so
And
funny.
that was my first passion.
I love
Um,
that.
yeah, yeah. And then
Okay.
yeah, so I wanted to be a whale trainer. I like that. I always liked space, and but yeah, I never really took it seriously until I got into to spirituality. Believe it or not, I was, I was thinking a lot about back at the time. This was when people were freaking out of 2012 and the end of the world and the return of Quetzalcoatl and the Judgment Day and all that sort of stuff. And I was reading all these books, all this spirituality, mysticism. I was born Christian, raised very Catholic in my family, and I was always thinking, okay, if I'm in this Earth here, where was I before? Was I in another star system? Was I, my sun sign, they say in astrology, is Sagittarius, whatever that means. It's like maybe I was in that constellation, that star system before coming to Earth. Where was I? So then I started thinking about the stars in a different way, and it was from a spiritual motivation. I wanted to know where I was before on Earth. So then that really pushed me into taking astronomy and astrophysics and studying the stars in a very deep manner.
So, I mean, okay, I just need to understand something. How old were you when you were thinking like this? This is like existential. Like, what was your age approximately?
Um, when I made that switch, it was a little bit older. I think I was maybe like 18 or so. But in my childhood, I mean, yeah, I wanted to be a whale trainer. I went to space camp.
You went to
When
space camp.
Yeah, that was okay.
When you were really little, did you feel like you were different? What were your parents like? I mean, were they just like, our child is really interesting and really curious, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but you hear some parents, they talk about their children like, we knew our child was different, we knew there was something special, we could not really work with our child, so we had to send our child away to special school where they were surrounded by geniuses. You know what I mean? Like, what was going on in that way? Because I'm going to tell you, when I was a kid, I was not thinking the way you're thinking, right? Like, I was a total 100% artist all the way down the line. So I just am trying to get some context around your thought process, because when I was researching your background, you've been involved in science forever, and you've been very well funded and pushed into different amazing places, and you've seized the day with all that. But when you were really little, were you like wandering around like thinking, what is this world I'm in? Who am I? And then was there a point where you realized that you were smarter than your parents?
I was born in Mexico City, about third or fourth generation Spanish and French. My father was working for Ore-Ida Potatoes in Boise, Idaho, and he met my mother, and they were neighbors. They got married. They had my brother in Boise, moved down to Mexico City, and then my father was running a fruit juice company. He was a CEO for a large fruit juice corporation in Mexico for about 25 years, and um, my brother, the oldest son, he had a lot of pressure. He became an entrepreneur right out of college. My mother did a lot of charity work. She worked with the Salesian nuns in Mexico, worked with the different orphanages, um, rehab centers, shelters for women, all this sort of charity work that the government overlooks in Mexico. And when I was growing up, I was in a kind of in a surreal environment. And I don't want to say, I was an outskirt, but surrounding by, a lot of entrepreneurs in my family, a lot of very successful people. And at the time, I was just wanted to play my bass guitar and write poems and do doodles on the paper. And that was my passion, in the artistic side. I always knew that I wanted to study cosmology and the universe in some degree, and I didn't really know how exactly. And the problem was that I wasn't very good at math. So in my senior year, in fact, I failed math. The and I had to, take what the British called the gap year. And in that time was great because I fed the homeless. I worked with my mother's foundation. What I would do, after um, in the morning, I would get up, go to these rehab centers where they would cook food. They would get buckets of food onto these trucks. I would drive around with these trucks with a couple other guys to the subway stations, to the parks, to the bridges, all these places around Mexico City where the homeless people were. And every day of the week, we would have a certain route, and we would repeat that every week. So then we would start seeing the same people over and over. And if there were kids on the street, we would gain their confidence. Give them juice and food and whatnot, and convince them to, if they wanted, there were orphanages that were available, or if there were women, there were women's shelters that were available, or if there were men on the streets, on addicts, we would take them to rehab centers, etc. So that was a big eye opener, and at that time I was doing a lot of soul searching. I was still very much right hemisphere brain, um, still playing, writing my own music, writing poetry, all sorts of stuff like that. And that was a moment of soul searching, and then I moved to Suffolk University.
So you were in high school. And what were you doing in high school though? Because you talked about when you were really little and you were interested in all kinds of things and you were writing music and what were you playing guitar? I think you're like one of these Renaissance kids where you're doing all kinds of cool things, like wherever your curiosity was taking you, you were doing it. And then of course you were really involved in altruistic experiences where you're helping other people. But where was the bridge from elementary school to high school?
So in elementary school, I played the clarinet in second and
Oh,
third grade, and I was put into the high school honors band as a second grader. And that was kind of strange
second
because,
grade. Oh
yeah,
my
I was a,
gosh.
was a little kid.
You're one of those genius that's what I'm telling you. I knew it. When I was researching, I'm like, this is one of these like these genius kids, like who from very early age, like the parents knew that they had a genius. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Like, here's the thing. I'm as I was looking you up, I'm like, why didn't this man just go work at NASA? Why did he become an entrepreneur? I'm trying to get you to help me through the journey of your childhood to like how you started a company for God's sakes. I mean, everyone with your brain power doesn't do this. When you were growing up, your parents were they looking at you like, "Wow, we got a strange bird on our hand, man. This kid is like, look at him. Look at him go. Like, we got to figure out how to put him in stuff." It's kind of like, Tiger Woods' dad when he realized that his kid was like a genius golfer, or Serena Williams' dad. Like, he put his daughters through this, these are athletes, of course, incredible paces, or even Long Long, like the most, one of the greatest, pianists of all time. Like you kind of wondered like what were the signs when they were a kid that put him in this position.
Yeah, I mean, I like to do a lot of puzzles. I don't know. My mom always said that I had tremendous concentration, so I would just focus. Do puzzles for hours.
Oh,
Very
I love
early age.
that.
Yeah, I did puzzles. I wanted to be a whale trainer. I had a rough start with math. Um,
The math thing, you keep bringing that up, which I find interesting, because I've had previous conversations with scientists, other STEM professionals, and they're very successful in their craft. They're very successful in their careers. Every single one of them told me they struggled with math. And I'm shocked by this because somehow their struggles with math did not deter them from the success they are having now and today, which is what I'm hearing from you. I mean, I find it incredible.
yeah, and I think that's why we like math so much because it's difficult, and we love
Mm.
physics, but physics hates us, and I think that's part of the challenge, part of the fun.
Physics hates us. I love that. So when you were in high school, at that point, this is before you got to, University of Hawaii, but were you involved in STEM in high school or you said you played clarinet, you wrote poetry. I mean, were you like thinking you were going to be an artist or were you I know you said you wanted to be, someone that, trains whales, but when you were in high school, there's no way you were still thinking that. Like what was happening in high school?
Yeah, in high school, I didn't know what I wanted to be. I would wheel in my
Mm.
amplifier to the courtyard in high school and just start playing my music. I wasn't really the person that's on time. I had, orange hair. I had, the big, Jinkos, which was in fashion at the time. So I was kind of like the black sheep, especially with the family of entrepreneurs, right? I was the artist. I was kind of yeah, the one that was the outsider, forging a path of my own.
Mhm.
And yeah, and I failed math in high school, then took the gap year, did charity work in Mexico, which was super rewarding, in many ways that science can't offer, doing philanthropy. And and then I went to Boston and I studied. I wanted to be, continue with the poetry, so I went into creative writing, and I realized
Good.
fast that I had to read a lot of English books, and that wasn't for me. So then I changed majors to biology, and then I realized that I wasn't really good at identifying plants. And then that was around the time when I was looking into the star systems, and to figure out where I was before this Earth. And then I applied to some astronomy programs. There was one in Hawaii, one in New Zealand, one in Australia. And then I ended up on the big island of Hawaii. And then I remember this was June 17th, 2008. And that was my first day landing on the big island. It was my first astronomy class. And my professor for that class was somebody named William Hartmann. And William Hartmann was the founder of the leading theory of the formation of the moon. So, in the early protoplanetary solar system, there was a collision.
Oh,
I applied to different schools in astronomy, and really it was an attempt to find out a spiritual answer to my questions. And that's what motivated me to get into astronomy. And this was at the time where I kept failing math. I was no good at, of course, you have to do a lot of math to do astrophysics, but I wasn't any good at math. Um, I was reading a lot of, Return of Quetzalcoatl, the Cygnus mystery, all this kind of far out, astrologies and mysticism and things like that. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to study the stars seriously. So then I went to Hawaii, and the big island of Hawaii. That was the transition period. When I changed my major. I was first in creative writing, then biology, and then I was still very much an artist. And then applied to some schools abroad and got into the one on the big island of Hawaii. And the first day, the first astronomy teacher was a guy named William Hartmann, who developed the leading theory for the formation of the moon. Actually, and his professor was Gerald Kuiper. So if you ever if you've ever heard about the Kuiper belt, it's a belt of icy rocks, kind of icy asteroids beyond the orbit of Neptune. Pluto is one of the most prominent of these Kuiper belt objects. So I realized, okay, here's a guy whose professor when he was growing up was Gerard Kuiper, and now this guy, Bill Hartmann, he developed the leading theory for the formation of the moon, which about like 3.5 billion years ago or so was an object about the size of Mars that collided with the Earth, and a lot of the crustal isotopes and the elements from this impacting object coalesced and formed the moon. And and I was like, oh my gosh, this is really crazy. I never knew that on the Big Island of Hawaii it had such rich history in astronomy. And that was the time when I had a wonderful math teacher. It was the guy who started writing hieroglyphics on the chalkboard. He just got a PhD from Caltech. He was a young guy. He's 27 years old, and and then that's when it clicked for me. I was like, okay, numbers and math are a medium to express, just like colors, just like music, just like clay if you're making a sculpture, just like a marble for a sculptor, for example. And that's when it really clicked for me. That's when I realized that numbers are a way to express. So then, being an artist, I put that number, world into my toolbox to express things that I was expressing through my poetry, things that I was expressing through my music, and other things already. So that was a major turning point for me.
and so you credit that to a teacher. I mean, your teacher inspired you. I mean, you were just really like, if you hadn't had that teacher, do you think you would be where you are today?
Probably not. Maybe so. It would have been maybe more of a roundabout way, but it's hard to
Mhm,
say
mhm.
because there's a good quote that says, "Destiny is what happens when you're taking the path to avoid it." Right? so so
Okay,
maybe
wow.
I was
Wow.
trying to avoid it. Maybe it would have been a roundabout way, but it still would have fit in somewhere in destiny. I think.
I really enjoy hearing about this because I feel like you're an Edie in a stream, but you happen to have the right people in the right places at the right time so that you weren't going off into some random place that really would have put you in something that really didn't inspire you or interest you or to get you to the place of creating your company that you have now. You know what I mean? Like, um, you somehow got the right people in the right places. It is like the stars are aligning for you at a very early age. It doesn't sound like your parents were scientists at all or your siblings.
My mother was. She had a degree in mathematics and statistics,
Oh, okay,
but
okay.
she became an entrepreneur. She didn't, I guess, use her degree in a professional sense. She started some air filter companies. She had, foundations for charity work in Mexico.
I mean, so you got your math brain from your mom. I love that.
Yeah, and she was a musician as well, so that kind of helped.
Oh my god. Listen, I love moms. I'm a mom of 3 boys, so I'm always trying to give mom more credit than the dad. No offense, dads out
No, no
of the
problem.
world, but
I'm a father of two as well.
I'm like, I want to just do that. All right. I want to talk a little about your first job out of school. I think, as I was saying earlier, a lot of people in STEM, they are not entrepreneurs, or they just like it's not the place they're going. They're usually going to like work at a government job, like I said, NASA earlier, like research, pharma company, healthcare, whatever it is. When so you graduated from University of Hawaii, and then was that when you started moving to entrepreneurship, or did you do more schooling because you are a doctor, you have a PhD? So what was going on at that point?
Yeah. So I was in Hawaii. I got the undergrad in astronomy. I was working at the some of the telescopes. I was managing the planetarium there, doing planetarium shows. I worked on an
Hmm.
exoplanet detector for something called extreme adaptive optics, and this is a technique used by ground telescopes where they send a laser into the sky at about 80 kilometers in altitude to an ionized sodium layer, and they can image the laser's interaction with the atmosphere, and they put that laser right next to a star that they want to look at with the telescope, and then they can subtract the atmospheric distortions on the starlight, so it's as if your telescope was above the atmosphere looking out into space, kind of like the Hubble Space Telescope. So and
Hmm.
at the time, this was a revolutionary procedure where ground-based telescopes could get better resolution than space-based telescopes through this process of adaptive optics. So I had some science projects there. Then in 2011, I went out to the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I was working there on a project related to Saturn, something called the Saturnian kilometric radiation. This is a very low frequency radio emission of Saturn, and was using satellite observations. I was doing a lot of kind of radio and plasma physics there. And at that time, I was very fortunate to get connected with amazing scientists. Um, and so then I graduated, and I went out to a school called Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. And
And why did you choose that?
yeah, so I applied to some different grad schools, and they called right a couple weeks before my graduation and said that if I maintained a 3.5 GPA, I could go there for, and teach physics for pilots and get a stipend.
Oh, interesting, because you said physics earlier was like, torture
Yeah,
or abuse.
yeah, it was. It was.
Explain this to me. Okay, great. I mean,
Yeah, well, after I got that really good math teacher and those good astronomy teachers, then I started getting good
oh,
at it.
okay.
Yeah.
Goes. I mean, my middle son, he took physics in high school, and it was really hard for him. And he has a mathematical mind, but he says physics like knocked him out. Like he just it almost killed him.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a rough start
Okay,
for
so
sure.
yeah, definitely. Okay, so then you went to what was the school that you went to in Florida again?
It's called
Go ahead.
Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University.
Okay. Okay.
It's mostly a pilot school. I So I
Yeah.
taught physics for pilots for the good majority of my grad school life. I could never fly myself. I'm colorblind, but I did help people understand the physics of it. And it was funny because I would get the Top Gun kind of undergrads that would come in with their big leather jackets, and they'd be like, the only forces in the universe are lift, drag, and thrust.
You know what? I mean, the minute you say Top Gun, I have a vision in my head immediately, without hesitation. So I love that.
Yeah,
What was it? Wait. What is it? Lift what?
lift, drag, and thrust. You know, and so then I had to,
Lift, drag, and thrust.
just like an
Wow.
airplane. You know,
Yes. Yeah, but I'm thinking something different because it's Top Gun. So just go ahead.
right. So then I was at Embry-Riddle, and I went into a master's program in engineering physics. So I was teaching physics for pilots and working towards my degree. And my master's thesis was on something called CubeSat, plasma interactions and plasma wakes. So,
Hmm.
satellites that are moving through the charged particle or plasma environment in space, these charged particles accumulate on satellite surfaces and can charge the satellite. So let's say if one side of the satellite gets a lot of charge and the other side doesn't, then there's an electric potential difference. It can start making these strong currents and arcs and discharges. And if this electric potential is too strong, it can fry your spacecraft systems. So this is something called spacecraft charging. And then there are other spacecraft plasma interactions like wakes. So a satellite moving through the plasma environment leaves a wake, just like a boat. A boat going on the lake, it'll have the bow shock in the front, and then in the back, it'll make a kind of like a cone shaped wake. So I would model and study these cones, these wakes
Hmm.
of the CubeSat class of satellites, and this was back in 2012 to 2014 or so. And this is when,
Hmm.
CubeSats were all the new rage. This was at the beginning, where a lot of universities were building small satellites to launch. And now we think about it today and how far we've come, with the Starlink
Hmm.
sending what, thousands upon thousands of these nanosats. But back then, the interactions of these nanosats with the plasma environment wasn't very understood. They,
And so this is what you were working on and studying, though.
yeah, that's right. So that's what I was working on studying for my master's work.
Hmm.
I did a few different projects, and then I went out back to Goddard Space Flight Center, the NASA Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, for a second time, and I was working with some more, spacecraft charging stuff. Um,
So let me ask you. So when you're going back and forth, because I hear you, traipsing all over the country, doing all these really amazing things with satellites and plasma and electro charges. Um, are these movements that you're initiating, or is this sort of, and forgive me for this because this is not a space that I operate in professionally, but is this a space where you initiate these movements, or do people see you and notice you like your math teacher and pulls you and says, we need to put you here, we need to take you here, you need to learn about this, we think you're interested in this area, you seem to be understanding this, like what, how does this even happen that you're going to another place to study something different?
I think the most accurate answer is that yes, I would, apply to these different things, but in the biggest moves in my career, there
Hmm.
was only one out of all of the applications that I sent that I got accepted with. So, for
Hmm.
example, I applied to many grad schools. I only got into Embry-Riddle, which was my top choice, so that wasn't that bad. I applied to various internships, different research programs. Didn't get into any. Well, I got into a few, but the NASA Goddard people, they pulled me in. So
Hmm.
I would mostly just make myself available, and then
Hmm.
they, once I meet one person in the field, then they talk to other people, and then kind of word goes around, and then they bring me in. At least that was my experience.
When you were moving around, right, to these different places and applying for different opportunities and meeting different people, when did entrepreneurship start setting into your mind? Like what were you thinking at this point? Because you could have easily just gone to work at some of these tech companies and made $1 million a year. Like some of these guys right now going into AI, with your knowledge and with your knowledge and experience and intelligence, they're making big bucks. And there's other, everybody else is like, I guess, trying to be an entrepreneur, but it seems like you would have had a lot of choices. So were you starting to get any tinglings of entrepreneurship at this point, or was that not even close to where you were back then?
Yeah. Well, there were definitely a lot of choices, and I heard some wise words by wonderful professor Dr. Ivanova from the University of Hawaii. He was a wonderful math professor, and she told me, Robbie, when you go out into the world, you're going to have so many possibilities, and the hardest thing to do is that out of all these options, you're going to have to choose one, and that's
Yep.
that's true. So the entrepreneurship, it started not by a desire to start a company, but it started with an idea. And the idea
Mm.
started forming when I finished the master's degree at Embry-Riddle after I did the CubeSat plasma density analysis, the CubeSat wakes. I had some, more, research experience at the NASA centers and whatnot. And then I started a PhD on a topic called kinetic physics. So, like I was mentioning earlier, if we have a glass of water, mathematically we can model the motion of the water as it's swishing around in our glass, right? We have the gravitational force, we have pressure gradients, and those are the main things. And the difference with the plasma is that it's a fluid, but it's not an electrically neutral fluid like the air that we breathe or water in the glass, but it's an electrically charged fluid. So now like your glass of plasma, if you will, it feels gravity, it feels pressure gradients, but it also feels electric and magnetic fields. And instead of looking at the whole fluid kind of slushing around, mathematically, you're doing a lot of statistical approximations, and you're not getting the high resolution of the super thermal particles. But then with the computers that were available and the computational resources, then I started studying the topic of kinetic physics. So instead of looking at the whole fluid, we're looking at individual particles in that glass of plasma, if you will. So individual particles bouncing around, and some of them are going really fast, some of them are going really slow. And what's interesting in space is that in space, the density is very low. So if you have a gas of same temperature and they collide a lot, then after a lot of collisions, the fast particles will become slow, the slower particles will kind of speed up, and then you'll have a mean, an average temperature or average velocity through the collisions. But in space, there are no collisions. So the particles that are very fast, they're not going to transfer energy and lose energy. The particles that are very slow, the cold plasma, they're not going to collide with higher energy ones, so they're going to stay slow. So, in other words, the whole fluid approximation of space plasma doesn't work, right? We can't make these assumptions or these crude approximations, if you will, of the whole macroscopic system because all these particles don't talk to each other. They don't collide, they don't transfer energy. So, really, the way to study this is through looking at individual particles. And that's the topic of kinetic plasma physics that I went into in the PhD.
And is this process that you're describing, which is very technical for me, I'm sure there's people that are listening that are going to completely understand and lock in to all the details of what you talked about. Is this question and some of the answers you discovered, is that what sparked your idea for your company, Electromancer Space Corporation? Is that kind of
Yes,
where it started?
yes, that's where the idea started, right? So, through the PhD, I was developing a code. It's called Chaos. It stands for the kinetic model of auroral ion outflows, and this is just looking at the individual particles that are escaping the Earth's ionosphere. So it's the loss of the Earth's atmosphere out into space. And what happens is that I was modeling all these different waves.
Wait, can I
So
ask you about
yes,
modeling? I don't want to get totally in the weeds on the technical because I know that there's people that want to know from a little bit of a bigger picture that are listening to my show. Um, but when you're talking about modeling, is this happening on the computer or is this happening with giant pieces of equipment that I've seen when I was at the Kennedy Space Center? I mean, what does that mean? And when you say modeling.
Yeah. So these are supercomputer codes.
So when you're working on, these models, these computer models and this code, where were you in this journey? Were you in a place where you're still trying to figure it out, or were you in a place where you could actually take this concept and idea in question and the data you have and say, you know what, let me go pitch this to XYZ company so they will pay me to finish this out? Or were you like at the point where you're like, let me do it myself? Like where does that take place? Like, how do you get from this big concept to coming up with a company instead of just letting someone else do it for you? I mean, you being the leader, the guide, or, whatever the title would be, the director of another company. Why do it yourself?
It started with the idea of actively changing the plasma environment around spacecraft to help them survive extreme space weather events. And what I was modeling were these wave particle interactions. So if we think about a buoy in the ocean, for example, and a wave comes, the wave will transfer energy to the buoy or the particle. And conversely, if we're in still water and the buoy is bouncing up and down, the buoy will transfer energy to the waves and make little ripples and whatnot. And I was modeling these wave particle interactions in the chaos model that I was developing throughout the PhD. And I was thinking to myself, gosh, instead of just running these different wave particle interactions on these supercomputer codes, matching to spacecraft data, doing these data model comparisons, what if we actually transmitted these waves in space in real life? And we could make electromagnetic bubbles around satellites, these force fields around spacecraft to help them survive extreme solar storms. So things like coronal mass ejections, geomagnetic storms, or also high altitude nuclear detonations that make artificial radiation belts.
Was this a question that was already in the market? I mean, were satellites being destroyed at that time and nobody could figure out how to stop that from happening?
Um, People had different ways to try to stop that from happening, but yes, satellites were getting destroyed from space storms all the time. That was very well known, and people would. There were a couple different ways to deal with it. The most common was just passive shielding, so they would have more layers of aluminum or these different materials to absorb the charges.
Mm.
But not many solutions were active, meaning repelling the charged particles before they arrive to the satellite. So that was kind of niche. It's very you know theoretically advanced, so not many people were doing that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so that was the idea, and that's what
Interesting.
started. So then, when I
Interesting.
finished the PhD, I went out to a postdoctoral fellowship with something called the NASA Drive Science Center for Geospace Storms. And this was a big collection of supercomputer codes modeling space weather events. I did that for 2 years in Los Angeles. And then after that post, I was like, this is the time to start my company. I've had this idea in my head for the past 10 years or so. It's now or never. And that was, I'm not going to lie, it was somewhat of an existential crisis. I needed to start that company because the pain otherwise was unbearable. Not having control over my ideas, not having absolute control to execute my ideas. If I didn't have that ability, that pain was just too great for me to handle. So
Mhm.
that was the main driver for me starting Electromancer Space Corporation.
Wow. And so when you're talking about pain, what is that pain like? What are you talking about? Are you talking about emotional, mental pain, physical pain, money pain, all the things? What is that? What is pain?
Yeah, what I meant by pain was kind of like existential pain, kind of like spiritual pain, if you will. Imagine you have something in your head and you need to get it out, and you need to get it out no matter what the cost. And I could have gotten it out wrote these patents with my previous employers, but then I wouldn't have complete control and direction over my baby ideas and etc. So it was that control that I needed. It was that um, the comfort and the security knowing that my ideas had the ability to grow in the way that I wanted them. The ideas are like having children, right? And a lot of
Mhm.
founders, and what's sad today, I think, with founders is especially, I mean, no offense to the VC people out there, but a lot of,
Yeah, don't offend the VC guys
I'm
because
not gonna offend them.
they were at the event that we met and they're trying to write
Right,
checks.
right, yeah.
Be nice to the VC guys.
I'll be nice to the VC guys, but what's important about like founders understand that their companies are living organisms. They're like children, and you want to see them grow. You want to see them be successful, and not having that control to be a parent of that idea or that company for me was very difficult. So
Yep.
anyway,
So
that
you
control over the idea is what led me to found the company.
so you talked about the patent process. So do you so this is a very challenging part for a lot of founders and a lot of, inventors and people that create things. Did you know about patenting your work or did somebody tell you about this? Like how did you even when did that start taking place? Did it take place when you were at the school in Florida or was it sort of on your road trip to California?
So this was after the postdoctoral fellowship at UCLA in California at the NASA Center, the NASA Drive Science Center for Geospace Storms. And it was after that post that I filed the first patent for the technology that we're developing.
Wow. And how many patents do you have at this point?
Um, I have two, and I'm gonna put another patent pending.
Hmm, hmm. I mean, the patent process is complicated and a lot of people get really lost with it. So I'm excited to actually hear you mention that you understand the concept of ownership and intellectual property, which is part of the pain I was asking about earlier. Being able to own your stuff, for legacy, for family, for generational wealth, for your own peace of mind, to put a stake in the ground. My father has a patent. He's dead now, but he's got a patent for some specialty billiard training process. And it was he's always been an inventor. He was a little nutty, I have to admit. No offense, Dad, if you hear this, but that was he's the one that taught me about the power of ownership. And I love that she went through that. So you started moving towards your patent. Is that when you invented your company at that point? I mean, is that when you're just like, let me have this company now? Let me come up with a name. What should I call it? What do I write? I mean, what was that? When did that start happening?
Yeah, that's right. This all started in the summer of 2024, and that's when I was finishing up the work at the Center for Geospace Storms, and I was putting together this patent. And the thing about patents is what I realize is that they're ideas, and ideas are cheap, right? Everybody can have ideas to do something, but the hard part is to execute on those ideas. The hard part is to take that idea and make it a reality. And that's something that I learned really quickly. Yes, I had the patents, but then I was like, okay, now I really have to, build it, get the team, get the resources, get the facilities, get the experts, get the backers, everything, and make this a reality. So that was one of the early stage lessons that I'm sure every founder finds out.
The hard way, sometimes not the hard way. It really depends. I mean, sounds like even though you're from a family of entrepreneurs, you might be the first generation of all the way in entrepreneur, like from soup to nuts. I don't know, what type of entrepreneurship your parents were involved in, but you're describing a rich and complicated process. What does the name mean? Where did you come up with the name? And how was that something that you were trying to figure out right away? Because one of the questions I get all the time, should I name my company now? Should I do my logo now? Should I spend all my money on my logo in the beginning? Or should I wait? Like, I don't know. I feel like I need to do this first. And I always tell people, like, look, the least of your concerns is your logo. You know what I mean? The name is almost more important than the logo because you can trademark the name. But Electromancer Space Corporation, what does that name mean? Why did you name it that? And when in the process of you starting a company did you formalize the name of your company?
Well, I put together the whole, nuts and bolts. I had another co-founder. We did the incorporation in Los Angeles, and it was about September of 2024. We were going back and forth with different names. And Electromancer just spoke to me. It was, if you think about, the mancer word, like that is like a magician, somebody that, can change the environment. Or if you think like a necromancer, right? Everybody knows like they're putting magic to, to raise the dead, but I'm not dealing with dead people. I'm dealing with plasma. So electric fields, electromagnetic fields. So that's the mancer of electricity. So electromancer. And I also like it because there's the word romance in there, so it's a little bit sentimental. So I got the Electromancer part, and then the Space Corporation. I liked it because the acronym is ESC, or Escape. So everybody on their computer on the top left corner
Oh
has
my
that
God.
button of Escape. So
It's
if you
perfect.
yeah, so if you think about like the existential pain to have control over my ideas that drove me to start this company, that was my escape. That was my ESC, my escape button.
Oh my gosh, I love it. So I looked at the visual branding. How would you describe your logo? I heard you earlier say you are colorblind. My father in law, who was a mathematician, was also colorblind. How do you describe your visual identity and where did you get it?
I did a couple by hand, and I was mostly looking for a good font. So it was a font that I ended up finding that really settled in. And the logo, I think, right now is kind of basic, but I do have a sigil. So a sigil is something that mystics use to put intention into a certain symbol, right? So, like angels have sigils, they're different little symbols that have a lot of intention. So, I made a sigil for Electromancer Space Corporation, and that's really the main logo.
Thanks so much for this wonderful conversation, Robert. This is amazing. And I want to thank all of my listeners for joining us today on the Honest Field Guide podcast featuring Electromancer Space Corporation. To learn more about Electromancer Space Corporation, visit your generative AI search of choice or conduct a basic Google search. Thank you so much again for joining me on the Honest Field Guide podcast, and we'll see you next time. Bye. The Honest Field Guide is produced by the team at Birk Creative, where brand and multi channel strategies are designed to help you get attention, grow, scale, and keep up with the pace of change. The music on the podcast is written and performed by Utah Carroll. You can find their songs everywhere online to buy or stream. The opinions expressed on the Honest Field Guide are solely those of the host and guests.